Hi everybody, welcome back to Spooky Story Tuesdays. Tonight we have a really special lineup of the classics. It is a dark and stormy night here in Chicago. It's raining, it's cozy, and it's a perfect night to read The Raven and then some other stories that to me are classics that helped shape my childhood and my desire to be a writer. So I am looking forward to sharing them with you. So I just want to wait and see if we get a few more views before I start. Maybe you can hear the thunder in the background. Maybe you will see some flashes of lightning. It is really storming here. So this is nice. This is a nice way for us to begin. And then as you can see, Oscar is deep down in the coziness here in the background. He's having a little snooze. And my special guest tonight, so this is a little cheesy, but my special guest tonight is my new friend, Milton. So I'm sure some of my friends freaked out thinking that I had gotten a new snake in quarantine and that I was going to show you a real snake, but this is Milton. He is a stuffed anaconda. He's really big. Woo! Somebody that knows me and loves me, my dear friend Gretchen Hendrick in Connecticut, got me this as a late birthday present from the World Wildlife Fund. It was one of those cute anaconda adoptions, and let me just tell you that this was the coolest surprise gift ever. It came with a little certificate of adoption, and it came with like a little fact sheet about anacondas, and then obviously this giant plush. And when I saw this package in our package room, I was like, what the heck did I order from the World Wildlife Fund? So I highly recommend this as an awesome surprise gift for people who love animals, including adult friends, because this was really wonderful. And obviously some of the proceeds go to help the World Wildlife Fund, and you guys know that I'm a huge animal lover. So this is Milton. He is going to be my special guest for a little bit while I get things underway. There we go. All right, so tonight is Classics Night. Dark and stormy night here in Chicago. Perfect for us to dig deep into some of the more cerebral classic spooky stories. So tonight's readings are going to be the least kid-friendly that I've done so far. So I'm warning you ahead of time. There will be 2 stories that are for children, and actually the other 3 are all stories that I read in either middle school or high school. So they technically can be kid-friendly, but for the little ones, I'm not so sure. We'll get into some darker themes as well, and some darker quarantine-themed themes. I figure it could be cathartic, it could be helpful, it could just kind of tune us into folklore around flus and sicknesses and plagues throughout time, because one of the stories I'm going to share is going to be hundreds of years old. So let me tell you about our lineup. First I'm going to read The Raven. Then we're going to read High Beams from the Scary Stories collection. And the reason why I'm considering that a classic is because it is a commonplace urban legend that you still hear about today. It's funny, I think once or twice a year I still get one of those chain Facebook messages from somebody I know who's warning me to look under my car before I get in case there's a killer hiding under there, and not to pull over on the highway if somebody flashes their high beams because they're obviously going to kill me. So this is an older urban legend, obviously stemming from the time that since we've had cars, but it still persists today. Then we're going to read portions of The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Some of these stories are too long to read all of, but they're too good to just read you one excerpt, so I'm going to take us through the story in chunks, and hopefully you'll get the whole gist of it. If not, you can find these stories online. And then one of my all-time favorites, Tomorrow's Child by Ray Bradbury, also known as The Shape of Things. And then we'll end with the quarantine plague-themed old folk tale that's reinterpreted by Alvin Schwartz called Maybe You Will Remember. So, and yes, everybody can see that Oscar is deep down in the coziness and the grooming tonight. So, he's my other special guest, always. All right, let's do it. Let's read The Raven. Tonight, I have water, and I also have my wine. Everybody get cozy and drink every time I say the word haunted. All right, Milton's blocking the candle. There. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this, and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that scarce I was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore?" This I whispered, and an echoed murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping, somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see, then, what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for we cannot help agreeing that no living being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of never, nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that lamplight gloated o'er, but whose violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er, she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee. Respite, respite, and nepent from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepent, and forget this lost Lenore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore. Tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant ivy it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thou soul hast spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door, quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. How about that, everybody? Incredible. Everybody take a deep breath after that. Welcome for our latecomers. It's good to see you. I hope that you have all been staying safe and well. I, for one, think that April has been a great year. We have been hanging in there, and I hope that wherever you are, we continue to do that. Thank you for joining us on this dark and stormy night in Chicago. And this is Milton, my new friend from the World Wildlife Fund. Thank you, Gretchen Hendrick, for this awesome birthday present. And then you can probably see Oscar in the background, building his nest. So let's move on. Building his nightly nest. And my friend Raven here perching. The next story that we're going to read, I explained earlier, I consider this a classic because it's such a prevalent urban legend and we still hear about it today. We still get odd Facebook chain messages warning us about things that can happen to you on the highway or things that can happen to you in a dark parking lot. So I wanted to share the story High Beams from the Scary Stories book. And it'll give us a little break before we move into the next dark tale. The girl driving the old blue sedan was a senior at the high school. She lived on a farm about 8 miles away and used the car to drive back and forth. She had driven into town that night to see a basketball game. Now she was on her way home. As she pulled away from the school, she noticed a red pickup truck follow her out of the parking lot. A few minutes later, the truck was still behind her. I guess we're going in the same direction, she thought. She began to watch the truck in her mirror. When she changed her speed, the driver of the truck changed his speed. When she passed a car, so did he. Then he turned on his high beams, flooding her car with light. He left them on for almost a minute. He probably wants to pass me, she thought, but she was becoming uneasy. Usually she drove home over a back road. Not too many people went that way, but when she turned onto that road, so did the truck. I've got to get away from him, she thought, and she began to drive faster. Then he turned his high beams on again. After a minute, he turned them off again. Then he turned them on again, and then off again. She drove even faster, but the truck driver stayed right behind her. Then he turned his high beams on again. Once more her car was ablaze with light. What is he doing, she wondered. What does he want? Then he turned them off again. But a minute later, he had them on again, and he left them on. At last she pulled into her driveway, and the truck pulled in right behind her. She jumped from the car and ran to the house. "Call the police," she screamed at her father. Out in the driveway, she could see the driver of the truck. He had a gun in his hand. When the police arrived, they started to arrest him, but he pointed to the girl's car. "You don't want me," he said. "You want him." Crouched behind the driver's seat, there was a man with a knife. As the driver of the truck explained it, the man slipped into the girl's car just before she left the school. He saw it happen, but there was no way he could stop it. He thought about getting the police, but he was afraid to leave her, so he followed her car. Each time the man in the back seat reached up to overpower her, the driver of the truck turned on his high beams. Then the man dropped down, afraid that someone might see him. High beams. All right, folks. Okay. The next story that we're going to read is going to be The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. So we're going to go through the main parts of the story. I'm not going to read all of it because we would be here for a very long time, but I also don't want to skim over parts or just read one excerpt because I want to make sure that we get through it. So I sort of curated the next two stories so that we're getting the meat and potatoes of everything without having to spend 2 hours reading. And quite frankly, it's really hard. It's easy to talk for 45 minutes, but it's really hard to read. Anyway, wine helps. So The Lottery by Shirley Jackson was one of my favorite stories as a child. It shaped my understanding of the genre of horror, and it also shaped my interest in becoming a writer. And she, of course, also wrote The Haunting of Hill House, which turned into the movie The Haunting, which is my all-time favorite ghost story movie. All right, so bear with me. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took only about 2 hours, so it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for dinner. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play, and their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced his name Delacroix, which I just did, I guess it's Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. The girls stood aside, talking among themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to their hands of their older brothers and sisters. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together, away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, Oh, bless me. Came shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women standing by their husbands began to call to their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran laughing back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, teenage club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square, carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, there's some thunder, followed him, carrying a 3-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" there was a hesitation before 2 men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell and began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good-humoredly to let her through. 2 or 3 people said, in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd, "Here comes your Mrs. Hutchinson, and Bill, she made it after all." Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, said cheerfully, "Thought we were going to have to get up on without you, Tessie." Mrs. Hutchinson said, grinning, "Wouldn't have had me leave my dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" And soft laughter ran through the crowd as the people stirred back into position after Mrs. Hutchinson's arrival. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list. "All ready?" he called. "Now I'll read the names, heads of families first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Everything clear?" The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, "Mr. Adams." A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. "Hi, Steve," Mr. Summers said, and Mr. Adams said, "Hi, Joe." They grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand. "Allen," Mr. Summers said, "Anderson, Bentham." "Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries anymore," Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves in the back row. "Seems like we got through with the last one only last week." Skipping ahead a bit. Old man Warner snorted. "Pack of crazy fools," he said. "Listening to the young folks. Nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Lived that way for a while. Used to be saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery," he said petulantly. "Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody." "Some places have already quit lotteries," Mrs. Adams said. "Nothing but trouble in that," old man Warner said stoutly. "Pack of young fools." After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, "All right, fellows." For a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, "Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons?" Then the voices began to say, "It's Hutchinson. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it." "Go tell your father," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quietly, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him enough time to take the paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." "Be a good sport, Tessie," Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said, "All of us took the same chance." "Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchinson said. "Well, everyone," Mr. Summers said, "that was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time." He consulted his next list. "Bill," he said, "you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons?" "There's Don and Eva," Mrs. Hutchinson yelled. "Make them take their chance." "Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie," Mr. Summers said gently. "You know that as well as anyone else." "It wasn't fair," Tessie said. "I guess not, Joe," Bill Hutchinson said regretfully. "My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's only fair. And I've got no other family except the kids." "Then as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you," Mr. Summers said in explanation. "And as far as drawing for households is concerned, that's you too, right?" "Right," Bill Hutchinson said. "How many kids, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked formally. "3," Bill Hutchinson said. "There's Bill Jr. and Nancy and little Dave, and Tessie and me." "All right then," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you got their tickets back?" Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. "Put them in the box then," Mr. Summers directed. "Take Bill's and put it in." "I think we ought to start over," Mrs. Hutchinson said as quietly as she could. "I tell you it wasn't fair. You didn't give him enough time to choose. Everybody saw that." Moving forward a little bit. "All right," Mr. Summers said. Everybody opened the papers. "Harry, you open little Dave's." Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time, and both beamed and laughed, turning around to the crowd and holding their slips of paper above their heads. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. "It's Tessie," Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. "Show us her paper." "Bill?" Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it, the black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with the heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said. "Let's finish quickly. Although the villagers have forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box long ago, they still remembered how to use the stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, grasping for breath, "I can't run it all. You'll have to go ahead and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on now, everyone." Steve Adams was in front of everyone, in front of the crowd of villagers, with Mrs. Graves beside him. "It isn't fair. It isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. Another powerful story. So we're going to shift gears a little bit to something a little bit more sci-fi. We're going to read parts of a story, take you through the storyline of Ray Bradbury's The Shape of Things, also known as Tomorrow's Child. This is another story that shaped my idea of horror and creative writing and what it meant to tell stories. And it's also very disturbing, but with a bit more of a happy ending, if you want to call it that. I know this isn't a lit class, but if you ever wanted to get into this, I would love to talk about it. So, Tomorrow's Child. And it is still raining and thundering and lightning, so I know that Some of you can probably see it or hear it. All right, and once again, that was The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. And I left out probably about 2 pages worth, so there's still more depth to the story. And the same will be true for Tomorrow's Child by Ray Bradbury. He did not want to be the father of a small blue pyramid. Peter Horn hadn't planned it that way at all. Neither he nor his wife imagined that such a thing could happen to them. They had talked quietly for days about the birth of their coming child. They had eaten normal foods, slept a great deal, taken in a few shows, and when it was time for her to fly in the helicopter to the hospital, her husband held her hand and kissed her. "Honey, you'll be home in 6 hours," he said. "These new birth mechanisms do everything but father the child for you." She remembered an old-time song, "No, no, they can't take that away from me," and sang it, and they laughed as the helicopter lifted them over the greenway from country to city. The doctor, a quiet gentleman named Wolcott, was very confident. Polly Ann, the wife, was ready-made for the task ahead, and the father was put, as usual, out in the waiting room where he could suck on cigarettes or take highballs from a convenient mixer. That dates the story, doesn't it? He was feeling pretty good. This was his first baby, but there was not a thing to worry about. Polly Ann was in good hands. Dr. Wolcott came into the waiting room an hour later. He looked like a man who had seen death. Peter Horn, on his 3rd highball, did not move. His hand tightened on the glass, and he whispered, "She's dead." "No," said Wolcott quietly. "No, no. She's fine. It's the baby." "The baby's dead." "The baby's alive, too, but drink the rest of that drink and come along after me. Something's happened." Yes, indeed, something had happened. The something that had happened had brought the entire hospital out into the corridors. People were going and coming from one room to another, as Peter Horn was led through a hallway where attendants in white uniforms were standing around peering into each other's faces and whispering. He became quite ill. "Hey, looky, looky, the child of Peter Horn, incredible!" They entered a small, clean room. There was a crowd in the room, looking down at a low table. There was something on the table. A small, blue pyramid. "Why have you brought me here?" said Horn, turning to the doctor. The small blue pyramid moved. It began to cry. Peter Horn pushed forward and looked down wildly. He was very white and was breathing rapidly. "You don't mean that's it?" The doctor named Wolcott nodded. The blue pyramid had 6 blue snake-like appendages and 3 eyes that blinked from the tips of projecting structures. Horn didn't move. "It weighs 7 pounds, 8 ounces, someone said." Horn thought to himself, "They're kidding me. This is a joke. Charlie Ruskell is behind all this. He'll pop in a door any moment and cry, 'April Fool,' and everybody'll laugh. That's not my child. Oh, horrible. They're kidding me." Horn stood there, and the sweat rolled down his face. "Get me away from here." Horn turned, and his hands were opening and closing without purpose, his eyes flickering. Wolcott held his elbow, talking calmly. "This is your child. Understand that, Mr. Horn." "No, no, it's not. It's a nightmare. Destroy it." "You can't kill a human being." "Human?" Horn blinked tears. "That's not human. That's a crime against God." The doctor went on quickly. "We've examined this child, and we've decided that it's not a mutant, a result of gene destruction or rearrangement. It's not a freak, nor is it sick. Please listen to everything I say to you." Horn stared at the wall, his eyes wide and sick. He swayed. The doctor talked distantly, with assurance. The child was somehow affected by the birth pressure. There was a dimensional disstructure caused by the simultaneous short-circuiting and malfunctionings of the new birth and hypnosis machines. "Well, anyway," the doctor ended lamely, "your baby was born into another dimension." Horn did not even nod. He stood there, waiting. Dr. Wolcott made it emphatic. "Your child is alive, well, and happy. It's lying there on the table. But because it was born into another dimension, it has an alien shape to us. Our eyes, adjusted to a 3-dimensional concept, cannot recognize it as a baby. But it is. Underneath that camouflage, the strange pyramidal shape and appendages, it is your child." Horn closed his mouth and shut his eyes. "Can I have a drink?" A little bit later, the doctor explains, "I think we may be able to change the child back. That's the point which makes me hesitate. If I thought the case was hopeless, I'd make out a certificate of euthanasia immediately. But it's at least worth a chance." And then here we have an illustration of our little baby friend. Baby looked upward through clearing mists. Baby saw the shapes moving over him and knew them to be friendly. Baby was newborn but already alert, strangely alert. Baby was aware. There were moving objects above and around Baby. 6 cubes of a gray-white color bending down. 6 cubes with hexagonal appendages and 3 eyes to each cube. Then there were 2 other cubes coming from a distance over a crystalline plateau. One of the cubes was white. It had 3 eyes too. There was something about this white cube that Baby liked. There was an attraction, some relation. There was an odor to the white cube that reminded Baby of itself. Shrill sounds came from the 6 bending down gray-white cubes, sounds of curiosity and wonder. It was like a kind of piccolo music, all playing at once. Now the 2 newly arrived cubes, the white cube and the gray cube, were whistling. After a while, the white cube extended one of its hexagonal appendages to touch Baby. Baby responded by putting out one of its tendrils from its pyramidal body. Baby liked the white cube. Baby liked. Baby was hungry. Baby liked. Maybe white cube would give it food. The gray cube produced a pink globe for Baby. Baby was now to be fed. Good, good. Baby accepted food eagerly. Food was good. All the gray-white cubes drifted away, leaving only the nice white cube standing over Baby, looking down and whistling over and over, over and over. And now we move a little bit forward after Polly Ann finds out about what her son is. He's not so bad, you know, she said. Once you get to know him, I can even hold him in my arms. He's warm, and he cries, and he even needs his triangular diapers. Here she laughed. Peter noticed a nervous tremor in the laugh, however. No, I didn't cry, Pete, because that's my baby. Or he will be. He isn't dead. I thank God for that. I don't know how to explain, still unborn. I like to think he hasn't been born yet, and we're waiting for him to show up. I have confidence in Dr. Wolcott, haven't you? You're right. He reached over and held her hand. You know something? You're a peach. I can hold on, she said, sitting there looking ahead as the green country swung under them. As long as I know something good will happen, I won't let it hurt or shock me. I'll wait 6 months, and then maybe I'll kill myself. Polly! She looked at him as if he'd just come in. Pete, I'm sorry, but this sort of thing doesn't happen. Once it's over and the baby is finally born, I'll forget it so quick it'll never have occurred. But if the doctor can help us, then a mind can't take it. A mind can only tell the body to climb out on a roof and jump. Things will be all right, he said, holding to the guide wheel. They have to be. She said nothing, but let the cigarette smoke blow out of her mouth in the pounding concussion of the helicopter fan. 3 weeks passed. Every day they flew into the institute to visit Pi. For that was the quiet, calm name that Polly Horn gave to the blue pyramid that lay on the warm sleeping table and blinked up at them. Moving ahead a little bit, this story's much longer. It's about 20 pages. By the way, this story takes place in the year 1989. It was written, I think, in 1948. Now they're seeing the doctor again after several months. I want to tell you what I've been doing in the last few months, Dr. Wolcott said. I've tried to bring the baby out of whatever hell dimension, 4th, 5th, or 6th, that it's in. Each time you left the baby for a checkup, we worked on the problem. Now we have a solution, but it has nothing to do with bringing the baby out of the dimension in which it exists. Polly sank back. Horn simply watched the doctor carefully for anything he might say. Wolcott leaned forward. I can't bring Pi out, but I can put you people in. That's it. He spread his hands. Horn looked at the machine in the corner. You mean you can send us into Pi's dimension? If you want to go badly enough. Polly said nothing. She held Pi quietly and looked at him. Dr. Wolcott explained. We know what series of malfunctions, mechanical and electrical, forced Pi into his present state. We can reproduce those accidents and stresses, but bringing him back is something else. It might take 1,000,000 trials and failures before we got the combination. The combination that jammed him into another space was an accident, but luckily we saw, observed, and recorded it. There are no records for bringing one back. We have to work in the dark. Therefore, it will be easier to put you in the fourth dimension than to bring Pi into ours. Polly asked simply and earnestly, "Will I see my baby as he really is if I go into his dimension?" Wolcott nodded. Polly said, "Then I want to go." "Hold on," said Peter Horn. "We've only been in this office 5 minutes, and already you're promising away the rest of your life. I'll be with my real baby. I won't care." "Dr. Wolcott, what will it be like in that dimension, on the other side?" Peter Horn asked. "There will be no change that you will notice. You will both seem the same size and shape to one another. The pyramid will become a baby, however. You will have added an extra sense, and you will be able to interpret what you see differently." But won't we turn into oblongs or pyramids ourselves? And won't you, Doctor, look like some geometrical form instead of a human? Does a blind man who sees for the first time give up his ability to hear or taste? No. Well, all right then. Stop thinking in terms of subtraction. Think in terms of addition. You're gaining something. You lose nothing. You know what a human looks like, which is an advantage Pi doesn't have. Looking out from his dimension, when you arrive over there, you can see Dr. Wolcott as both things, a geometrical abstract or a human, as you choose. It will probably make quite a philosopher out of you. There's the other thing, however, and that is, to everyone else in the world, you, your wife, and the child will look like abstract forms. The baby, a triangle, your wife, an oblong perhaps, yourself, a hexagonal solid. The world will be shocked, but not you. We'll be freaks. Yes, you'll be freaks, but you won't know it. You'll have to lead a secluded life, however, until you find a way to bring all 3 of us out together. That's right. It may be 10 years, 20. I won't recommend it to you. You may both go quite mad as a result of feeling apart, different. If there's a grain of paranoia in you, it'll come out. It's up to you, naturally. Peter Horn looked at his wife. She looked back gravely. "We'll go," said Peter Horn. "Into Pi's dimension," said Wolcott. "Into Pi's dimension." Fast forwarding. They both lay on the tables, holding hands, Polly and Peter Horn. A double black hood came down over them. They were both in darkness. From somewhere far off in the hospital, a voice clock sang, "Tick-tock, 7 o'clock, tick-tock, 7 o'clock," fading away in a little soft gong. The low humming grew louder. The machine glittered with hidden, shifting, compressed power. "Is there any danger?" cried Peter Horn. "None." The power screamed. The very atoms of the room divided against each other into alien and enemy camps. The 2 sides fought for supremacy. Horn gaped his mouth to shout. His insides became pyramidal, oblong, with terrific electric seizures. He felt a pulling, sucking, demanding power claw at his body. The power yearned and nuzzled and pressed through the room. The dimensions of the black hood over his torso were stretched, pulled into wild planes of incomprehension. Sweat pouring down his face was not sweat, but a pure dimensional essence. His limbs were wrenched, flung, jabbed, suddenly caught. He began to melt like running wax. A clicking, sliding noise. Horn thought swiftly but calmly, how will it be in the future with Polly and me and Pi at home and people coming over for a cocktail party? How will it be? Suddenly he knew how it would be, and the thought of it filled him with a great awe and a sense of credulous faith and time. They would live in the same white house on the same quiet green hill with a high fence around it to keep out the merely curious. And Dr. Wolcott would come to visit, park his beetle in the yard below, come up the steps, and at the door would be a tall, slim white rectangle to meet him with a dry martini in its snake-like hand. And in an easy chair across the room would sit a salt white oblong with a copy of Nietzsche open, reading, smoking a pipe. And on the floor would be Pi, running about. And there would be talk, and more friends would come in, and the white oblong and the white rectangle would laugh and joke and offer little finger sandwiches and more drinks, and it would be a good evening of talk and laughter. That's how it would be. Click. The humming noise stopped. The hood lifted from Horn. It was all over. They were in another dimension. He heard Polly cry out. There was much light. Then he slipped from the table, stood blinking. Polly was running. She stopped and picked something up from the floor. It was Peter Horn's son, a living, pink-faced, blue-eyed boy, lying in her arms, gasping and blinking and crying. The pyramidal shape was gone. Polly was crying with happiness. Peter Horn walked across the room, trembling, trying to smile himself, to hold on to Polly and the child, both at the same time, and weep with them. Well, said Wolcott, standing back. He did not move for a long while. He only watched the white oblong and the slim white rectangle holding the blue pyramid on the opposite side of the room. An assistant came in the door. Shh, said Wolcott, hand to his lips. They'll want to be alone a while. Come along. He took the assistant by the arm and tiptoed across the room. The white rectangle and the white oblong didn't even look up when the door closed. And there they are. Really one of just the best stories ever. That's Ray Bradbury's The Shape of Things, also called Tomorrow's Child, and a fantastic story. It is a longer story, so I kind of curated the sections that we read through to get to the full extent of the story, but I still highly recommend going back and reading the full story as well as the full version of Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. I'll give you all a minute to catch your breath. Take a drink of something. Reflect on your whole life and existence here in the next 5 to 15 seconds. Whew. All right. All right, and the final story that we're going to have tonight is going to be called Maybe You Will Remember. This one is from the Scary Stories series. This is a story that is related to plagues and sickness and quarantine. It's apropos for the time for obvious reasons. It could be cathartic, it could be frightening. I'm not one to shy away from anxiety. And it's also interesting because these kinds of stories, these kinds of folktales actually go back many hundreds of years. So this one has been modernized. And I just thought you would find it kind of fascinating, and then we'll go to the footnotes and read about the history of it. Okay, maybe you will remember. Mrs. Gibbs and her 16-year-old daughter Rosemary arrived in Paris on a hot morning in July. They had been on a vacation and now were returning home, but Mrs. Gibbs did not feel well, so they decided to rest in Paris for a few days before going on. The city was crowded with tourists. Still, they found a place to stay at a good hotel. They had a lovely room overlooking a park. It had yellow walls, a blue carpet, and white furniture. As soon as they unpacked, Mrs. Gibbs went to bed. She looked so pale that Rosemary asked to have the hotel's doctor examine her. Rosemary did not speak French, but fortunately the doctor spoke some English. He took one look at Mrs. Gibbs and said, "Your mother is too sick to travel. Tomorrow I will move her to a hospital, but she needs a certain medication. If you go to my home for it, it will save time." The doctor said he did not have a telephone right now. Instead, he would give Rosemary a note for his wife. The hotel manager put Rosemary in a taxi and in French told the driver how to find the doctor's house. "It will only take a little while," he told her, "and the taxi will bring you back." But as the driver slowly drove up one street and down another, it seemed to take forever. At one point, Rosemary was sure they had gone down the same street twice. It took almost as long for the doctor's wife to answer the door, then get the medicine ready. As Rosemary sat on a bench in the empty waiting room, she kept thinking, "Why can't you hurry? Please hurry." Then she heard a telephone ring somewhere in the house, but the doctor had told her he didn't have a telephone right now. What was going on? They drove back as slowly as they had come, crawling up one street and down another. Rosemary sat in the back seat filled with dread, her mother's medicine clutched in her hand. Why was everything taking so long? She was sure the taxi driver was going in the wrong direction. "Are you going to the right hotel?" she asked. He didn't answer. She asked again, but still he didn't reply. When he stopped for a traffic light, she threw open the door and ran from the cab. She stopped a woman on the street. The woman did not speak English, but she knew someone who did. Rosemary was right. They had been driving in the wrong direction. When she finally got back to the hotel, it was early evening. She went up to the desk clerk who had given them their room. "I'm Rosemary Gibbs," she said. "My mother and I are in room 505. May I please have the key?" The clerk looked at her closely. "You must be mistaken," he said. "There's another guest in that room. Are you sure you're in the right hotel?" He turned to help someone else. She waited until he was finished. "You gave us that room yourself when we arrived this morning," she said. "How could you forget?" He stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "You must be mistaken," he said. "I have never seen you before. Are you sure you are in the right hotel?" She asked to see the registration card they had filled out when they arrived. "It's June and Rosemary Gibbs," she said. The clerk looked in the file. "We have no card for you," he said. "You must be in the wrong hotel." "The doctor will know me," Rosemary replied. "He examined my mother when we arrived. He sent me for medicine she needs. I want to see him." The doctor came downstairs. "Here's the medicine for my mother," Rosemary said, holding it out to him. "Your wife gave it to me." "I have never seen you before," he said. "You must be in the wrong hotel." She asked for the hotel manager who had put her in the taxi. Surely he would remember her. "You must be in the wrong hotel," he said. "Let me give you a room where you can rest. Then maybe you will remember where you are and where you and your mother are staying." Here's a little illustration of a clock. "I want to see our room," Rosemary said, raising her voice. "It's room 505. But it was nothing like the room she remembered. It had a double bed, not twin beds. The furniture was black, not white. The carpet was green, not blue. There was someone else's clothing in the closet. The room she knew had vanished, and so had her mother. "This is not my room," she said. "Where is my mother? What have you done with her?" "You are in the wrong hotel," the manager said patiently, as if he were speaking to a young child. Rosemary asked to see the police. "My mother, our things, the room, they've all disappeared," she told them. "Are you sure you're in the right hotel?" they asked. She went to her embassy for help. "Are you sure it's the right hotel?" they asked. Rosemary thought she was losing her mind. "Why don't you rest here for a while?" they said. "Then maybe you'll remember." And there's the illustration of room 505. And we'll get a little bit into the history of the story. And how the story ends. What happened to Rosemary's mother? When the hotel doctor saw Mrs. Gibbs, he knew at once that she was about to die. She had a form of the plague, a dread disease that killed quickly and caused frightening epidemics. If word got out that a woman had died of the plague in the heart of Paris, there would be panic. People in the hotel and elsewhere would rush to escape. The doctor knew what the hotel's owners expected. He was to keep the case a secret. Otherwise, they would lose lots of money. To get Rosemary out of the way, the doctor sent her to the other side of Paris for some worthless medicine. As he expected, Mrs. Gibbs died soon after she left. Her body was smuggled out of the hotel to a cemetery where it was buried. A team of workmen quickly repainted the room and replaced everything in it. The desk clerks were ordered to tell Rosemary that she was in the wrong hotel. When she insisted on seeing her room, it had become a different place, and of course, her mother had vanished. All those involved were warned that they would lose their jobs if they gave away the secret. To avoid panic in the city, the police and the newspapers agreed to say nothing of the death. No police reports were filed, no news stories appeared. It was as if Rosemary's mother and her room had never existed. Picture of presumably the hotel. And there's more. In another version of the story, Rosemary and her mother had separate rooms. Mrs. Gibbs died during the night while Rosemary was asleep. Her body was removed. Then her room was repainted and refurnished. When Rosemary could not find her mother the next morning, she was told that her mother was not even with her when she checked in. After many months of searching, a friend, a relative, or the young woman herself finds someone who works in the hotel and, for a bribe, reveals what happened. This legend was the basis of a movie, So Long at the Fair, that appeared in 1950. The story also inspired two novels, one published as early as 1913, but the story was old even then. The writer Alexander Woolcott discovered that it had been reported as a true story in England in 1911 in the London Daily Mail and in the U.S. in 1889 in the Detroit Free Press. It became known throughout America and Europe. There you have it, friends. That was our lineup for tonight for Spooky Story Tuesdays. Tonight was Classics Night. Whew, deep breath. This is my friend Milton. He's an anaconda from a gift from my bestie Gretchen from the World Wildlife Fund. And on that note, I want to invite you to next week's Spooky Story Tuesdays, where our theme will actually be animals. So we'll share some folklore and spooky stories about our animal friends, and I'll have a real snake again. And I also have been getting a lot of questions about the snakes, or if people can ask questions about the snakes during, the course of the reading, which is totally fine. So if you have questions about any of the snakes that you've been seeing, or any of the live snakes you've been seeing over the last couple of weeks, feel free to send them to me, or come ready with your comments and questions then, and we can do a little Q&A or a show and tell in addition to those stories, so that all of our snake friends, and even our friend Oscar, who is not a snake but still can have their due spotlight as well. So again, thank you for joining me tonight, and enjoy this cozy, rainy, spooky evening. And I hope you stay safe and well, and I'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.